And we're going to go ahead and get started with our study. It's great to be able to be here with you this morning. Not sure. Is this mic on okay, Dennis? We're good? Okay. Okay, so last week Jamie finished up or wrapped up a great class on Christian evidences and just the confidence that we can have in what we believe, and I really appreciated that study. And what we're going to do here over the next several weeks to a couple months here is we're going to start a new study that in some ways builds off that, and in some ways it is a little different. But what we're going to study is a book, or I'm going to use a book in our study, but we're going to look at the birth of Jesus. And this is something that we feel like we know, right? We've heard that before. Every Christmas or whatever, we see people talking about it. We know, there was a census and they went to Bethlehem and all these different things were going on. But one of the things that as we are studying this, that I want us to help and we will explore, is that there are myths and traditions surrounding the birth of Christ that don't match up with what the Bible is talking about. And there is, one of the things that we often miss, or we often, it's hard to understand, is that the events in the Bible, the events that are recorded, they certainly were not happening in a vacuum, right? The world was going on, right? This is just a small section of what was going on in the world. And the people, the places, the thinking, all those different things play into what was going on, the mindset of what was going on. Why were the Jews acting the way they did? Why did they respond in the way they did? Why were there shepherds out there in the field? Like, why were they there? Why, who were they looking after? What impact did Herod have on this? Yes, we know what he did in the Bible, but there's stuff going on here. What was the star or the light that was in the sky, but also seemed to move, right? The Bible talks about it moving and shining over the place where the baby was. So these are all some things that we're going to explore. We're going to think about, and hopefully by the end of our study have a richer understanding of the events, who Zechariah was, what was going on at the temple, what was going on, why were people responding the way they were. And we think about our own lives, and we think about, who we are. I was born in Virginia. Well, why was I born in Virginia, right? Why did neither of my parents are from Virginia, right? My mom's from New York. My dad's from Ohio, or was. How did they meet, and how was I born in Virginia? See, because our story of who we are and where we live does not begin with us, right? It begins further back. It begins hundreds of years ago, maybe. And so when we're looking at the birth of Jesus, it doesn't begin with Caesar and Mary and Joseph and them having to go to Bethlehem to take part in the census. John chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Verse 9, that the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. There's a lot in there to unpack and to think about. I think the world and in our society, and because we're in this society, right? We're in this culture. We think of this, in the birth of Jesus in a certain way, right? Our frameworks by the nativity scene, right? We see the shepherds and Mary and Joseph in a manger and the wise men, right? And we see these, and that impacts us. But here we see, to understand this, to understand who Jesus was and what his birth signified and how that all transpired, we have to go back to the very beginning, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? That Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That Word that was with God and was God became flesh and made his dwelling among us in the birth of Jesus. So, to understand that nature, that purpose of Jesus and his birth, we really need to start at the beginning, right? We need to start at the beginning of the Bible. And we would need to, if let's go ahead and we're going to look at something in Genesis. So if you want to flip over to Genesis, we see this. In the beginning, God's creating the heavens and the earth through the Word. And to fully understand who Jesus is, what his birth signifies, to gain complete comprehension of it, we would need to study Genesis 1:1 all the way through Malachi 4:6. And there is so much there. There is so much to study, to dig into, to understand, that it is really beyond one human lifetime to be able to study and fully understand that. And so in some ways, we can just grasp just this small glimmer of what his birth meant, what his life was, and who Jesus is. Just as God is not fully knowable to us, in the sense that he is beyond our understanding, beyond our ability to comprehend, in some ways, the birth of Jesus and exactly what that means to us and through all in his life is also, it's just take more than a lifetime. So as we study this and as we get started here this morning and are going through this, we're going to hit high points. We're going to, we're not going to, maybe allay some fears here. We're not going to study all through the whole Testament, right? It's just going to take too long for the purpose of this class. What we are going to do is we're going to go through, we're going to look at some high points, we're going to follow some threads, and then we're going to pick up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as we are studying the birth of Jesus. Any thoughts or questions on this? Am I right? Am I wrong? We to fully understand the Bible, right? We can't just pick and choose different things. We do need to take it in its completeness. And as we same thing with when we're studying about the birth of Jesus. We see creation, and Mike was talking about Genesis and creation and the marriage relationship and how God set that out in Genesis and right from the beginning. But and it's hard to know exactly how long Adam and Eve were in the garden, right? But then we see that Satan came. He tempted them. The man and the woman, Adam and Eve, they sinned, and then God, in talking to them, he talks to the serpent, he talks to the woman or Eve, and he talks to Adam. But and this really is this is, when we think about the history of mankind, right? This is one of the darkest moments, right? The fall from that perfect relationship with Jesus, with God in the garden, right? No sin. God created it, and it was very good. It was into this sin entering, this rebellion, this against God, and they're having to leave, right? That is a dark time indeed. But here, God, in the midst of this darkness, right here, as he is pronouncing, look, you can't come, you're going to, all these kind of curses that we think of, right, in this pain and suffering, here in this, we get our first prophecy about Jesus. And it says, and it's this prophecy, but it's also this promise, right? In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Referring to Jesus and the what would happen. And we see that, right? We see that Satan strikes the heel, right? He does a wound, but that Jesus crushes the head. The ultimate victory would be his. And so this is the promise. This is the promise that God made right here, right after that. After Adam and Eve chose to sin, this is the hope that would happen. And we see in Genesis, right, we see that what happened and how they were indeed fruitful and multiplied, and that they spread out on the earth, but that there was wickedness. And we know that once again, that all of mankind would end up coming from two people, from Noah and his wife after the flood, and that God made a covenant again with Noah, right, to be fruitful and increase in number and to fill the earth, being fruitful and increasing. And then we see the Tower of Babel happen, where mankind came together and they had one language and one speech, and they wanted to set themselves up as gods, and that God dispersed them. And then we see the from Shem all the way down to Abram. And so this is a long time. When we read our Bible, when we study through it, it's just a couple chapters, and it's the length of time is often hard to comprehend. But here we see Terah being the father of Abram. And if you flip over to Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So this promise, Abraham and his wife are old, they're childless. But here God makes this promise to Abram that he will make him into a great nation, and that all peoples on earth will be blessed through him. And then we see God again in chapter 15, that God also again talks about the blessing of Abram and his heir. And we see Abram try to make descendants through his handmaiden, right, through Hagar and through Ishmael, but God says no. The promised son, the heir, would not come through that of natural birth or by natural means, but that would be the child of promise through his wife Sarah. And then in Genesis chapter 7, God once again, it says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between you, and you will greatly increase your numbers." Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. And I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give to you as an everlasting possession, to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." You see, God here making this promise of a great nation to Abraham's descendants for the generations to come, that God would be their God, to both to Abram and to the descendants after him. This covenant that God is making with Abram that was kind of marked by the mark of circumcision. And so Abram has Isaac through his wife Sarah. And we have Isaac having two sons, Esau and Jacob. And once again, Isaac being told that would have great nations coming from them. And indeed, Jacob ends up becoming Israel, we know, who had 12 sons. Isaac, whose other son Esau, also became great nations. Esau being the father of the Edomites, or Edom, who are also known as the Idumeans. And one of the interesting things that we'll look at here, or to note here, is that Herod the Great, the king at the time of Jesus' birth, was also an Idumean, who would have been a direct descendant of Esau. But Jacob, who became Israel, also had 12 sons. And one of the things that it's important to note here is that, we as we follow this through, is God's promise and the line of God's promise following through here. And we look in the New Testament and we get these genealogies, right, tracing the birth of Jesus all the way back through Adam. And so as we see this promise and this seed of this, going from one generation to the next, the question is, well, what's going to happen to them, right? And we see things happening, with the flood, right? Well, what happens in the flood? Well, the promise then goes through Shem, right? From Noah's family through Shem down to Abraham. Abraham doesn't have the promise to come would be a direct descendant of Abraham and Sarah, and we see the child of that promise in Isaac. Yeah.
I just thought of something while you were talking, and I was thinking in terms of going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Herod the Great that wanted to kill the baby that
Right.
was talking about his promise. You said he was a descendant of Esau,
Right.
right? Okay, backwards to. All right.
So he was an Idumean, who the Idumeans were of Edom, which is where Esau's descendants. Yeah.
Okay, so skip over. Esau's descendant. Then okay, now I'm getting confused by what I was saying.
It was Jacob and Esau were Isaac's sons.
But then remember that David and Joseph, his brothers, dumped him in the well, and
Mm-hmm.
he became a high-ranking guy in Egypt. But yet Hebrew was able to save the family of Jacob in order for the line to continue.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, what we see here, in this, well, why, looking backward, what you can kind of see is that, look, there was a famine coming, right? And so God, what was going to happen to Judah, who is through, the line of Judah is where Jesus came from. What would happen to Judah in this famine, right? And so Joseph ends up in Egypt, right? Separated from that, from the family and from that promise, but he ends up providing a way to protect or to keep, to feed, to make sure that family and Judah and the line go on.
Is that and then Moses in Egypt?
Uh, I'm not, I'm not sure. I guess basically the point I want to make in some of this thing is that, they like some of the when we're, the promise, as we're going through here is, and these promises of God are, there are reasons that these things are happening. There are, it is about the promise, right? The Old Testament is about the promise of the coming Messiah. And so some of these things, we think about, is the Israelites end up in Egypt as slaves, right, for 430 years, something right around in there. It's a long time. And it seems lost, right? Like they're like, well, it's, what's going to happen here now? But they end up coming out of this as a nation, right? And they go into 40 years later and to take into um, and inhabit and take over the land that God had promised to Abraham as an inheritance. All the time, the whole world is going to be blessed through Abraham. And so, it's there are certainly a variety of things going on there. But one of the things that God does, he continues to do, is to reaffirm this promise, reaffirm um, what is going to happen. And in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10, starting in verse 10, it says, Jacob left Beersheba and set out to Haran. And when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When we keep seeing this, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through your offspring, the meaning of this is not simply, when we think about all peoples on the earth, right? All means all. It doesn't make sense that it would just be the people right around Israel, right? All being all. And so when we see as as Israelites are in Egypt, and then for 430 years, 430 years is a long time. We think 10 years is a long time, right? A generation, 40 years is a long time. And certainly, I think one of the things that, for me anyway, when I'm reading and I'm studying the Old Testament, one of the things that the Old Testament teaches me is patience. The Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. How long, that's a long time. How long before the flood came did Noah start building the ark? How many years was Joseph in jail and in prison and going through that before he rose to do some other things, right? I think it was like 11, 12 years Joseph was just in prison. That's a long time. Moses at 40 was like, okay, there's, he kills an Egyptian who was mistreating the Israelites, thinking, okay, I'm going to lead them out right at 40. Then, 40 years later, after having spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep, then he comes back. 40 years is a long time. And so I think, in all these times, God, I think what is important for us to get out of some of these things is that God does not forget. That our short lifespans here of, and we think of things in terms of days, months. God thinks in terms of generations and decades, and just on a much bigger, just on a different scale, right? God is not slowing and keeping his promises, as some understand slowness. But during all this time, God does not forget the promise. And he does, he reaffirmed it with Abraham. He reaffirms it with Isaac and with Jacob. And as Israel, as they come out of Egypt, a nation of people, the promise of God we see moving forward as they inhabit the land. And we see that as the nations of Israel is there, over the years, the prophecies of the Messiah coming were spoken about over and over and over again. And we see, from kings and from prophets, we see that information about how, for example, in Psalm chapter 2, starting in verse 7, it says, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron, and you will dash them to pieces like pottery. The divinity of Jesus is spoken about over and over again in the Psalms, right? The Son, you'll be the Son of God. You are my son. Today I have become your father. Psalm chapter 1:10. And these are just, like I said, these are just some. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Quoted in the book of Acts. David is saying this. The Lord said to my Lord. Numbers 24, verse 17. I see him now. I behold him, but not near. And this is Balaam talking here, but he's a prophecy given to him by God. Balaam is saying, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Scepters and kingships will come out of Jacob. The kingship of the Messiah. So I want to end here today with just a couple more. I want to just end on these things as we let me go through a couple more. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 talks about how that Jesus would come from a virgin, that it would be a virgin birth. It talks about Mary. Let me see if I can flip over there real quick to read this one. It say, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Isaiah chapter 40 talks about John the Baptist, a voice of one calling in the wilderness. The purpose of that. Micah chapter 5 talks about the fact that it would be born in Bethlehem. Hosea chapter 11 talks about the flight to Egypt. That and so what we see here is that over and over again there are prophecies that are spoken about the coming of the Messiah, that they are recorded in the Old Testament. And what we see is, in great detail, not, and Jamie spoke about this somewhat, or in some as he was talking about the nature of prophecy, the specificity of prophecy, and what was to come, right? And what would happen. Now, some of these, as we're talking about these that were given, and there are varying degrees of specificity. There are, obviously being born in Bethlehem, having coming up out of Egypt, that there would be a prophet who would come right beforehand, that the babies would be killed in Bethlehem. All those sorts of things, some of those are extremely specific, right? That you wouldn't be able to retroactively try to fit yourself into those prophecies to make it so that you fulfilled those. But as the nation of Israel, and as what I want us to understand, and we'll pick up here next time on some of the more specifics on what led, what was going on and what led to some of the immediate historical events leading up to the birth of Jesus. But the prophets here were clearly looking forward to the day when the Messiah, the Son of Man, the Son of God, would come. We see that Israel had been chosen as the nation through which the Messiah would come. Israel, throughout the Old Testament, was given a special place as God's selected, chosen people. And through them, all the nations of the world would be blessed. But what we see here, as we're reading through the Old Testament, is that Israel was not faithful to God's laws. Right? We see that as a result of their unfaithfulness, they lost their place for a time in the promised land, that land in Canaan, and they were shipped off into exile in Babylon. And one of the things that I want to draw, and we'll end on this here today, is that here in the land of Babylon, in this time again of sorrow and pain, of being God again, in some ways mirroring what happened in right after the garden. He doesn't leave them in their misery, right? In their hopelessness. Lamentations, a book of lamentations, a book of sorrow and pain. In the middle of this is this, which is a song that we sing. Lamentations chapter 3, 22 through 26. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. And so here we see God's great love still apart, still emphasized in this land, this foreign land. And here we get, in this foreign land, we get specific times of when the Messiah would come through the prophet Daniel. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. As Daniel, we look at some of the prophecies that Daniel made, some of the visions that he saw, and what that meant for the people of Israel as they are looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your Son, Jesus. We thank you for the great love that is expressed in that, in his life and in his willingness to die for us, and the power that is exhibited in his resurrection. Lord, help us to study and understand the events leading up to his birth. Help us to understand the feelings, the emotions that were going through the Israelites during that time period as they looked forward to the coming Messiah. Help us, Lord, to understand your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.